Hey there, guys. We are talking about Chevalier. My great friend Tim Grierson is here. Of all the friends in all the world, I feel like Tim is the perfect guy because not only is he a champion fencer, he is also a virtuoso violinist and conductor.
I would have been offended if you had not invited me to review this movie because I have the background and the expertise to talk about it very knowledgeably. So thank you so much for having me. Absolutely.
The Venn diagram is so slim, right? Champion fencer,
Yeah.
virtuoso violinist, like it's you and it's the Chevalier de Saint-George.
One day, the whole world will know me. And of course, the music will be spectacular. Bold.
If you've not subscribed yet, you really should because you get witty banter like this and you get good friends like Tim Grierson from Screen International. He's helping me fill in. We have a few different friends coming through while Alonzo finishes up his latest book. So come and hang out with us. We'd be honored to have you as we grow the channel. Chevalier, it's in theaters. It's a story that you probably have not heard before. I know that I had not. Tim, had you heard this story before?
I had not heard this story before, despite my fencing background. I was not familiar with Joseph's story.
Right. So Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-George, was a mixed race man in Marie Antoinette's France. And his father was a French plantation owner. His mother was a slave. He is played here by Kelvin Harrison Jr. in just an electrifying, charismatic performance, which is often what buoys this thing when it starts to feel a little staid and a little safe. He is a man whose story we have not heard a lot about because a lot of his music and a lot of his story have been lost to time. Since he was a mixed race man, he ascended into like the highest echelons of court of society, but he could only go so far. Right. And so this story is about how he navigates the highs and lows of his identity, his music, his place in society, his place in the world. And it's a fantastic supporting cast. It's Lucy Boynton as Marie Antoinette, Samara Weaving as Marie Josephine, the very married and very white woman that he has an affair with. Some of this is true. Some of this is not, as is always the case with any kind of historical costume drama. But I wish that the director, Stephen Williams, and the screenwriter, Stefani Robinson, had maybe taken a few more chances. Like this is a person who was daring in his life and bold and dared to enter realms that somebody of mixed race had not and could not. So I wish the film itself had that kind of daring. What do you think, Tim?
I feel basically the same. I thought it was good enough to recommend, but not much more than that. It's funny because the movie, and I haven't gone back to do the research in terms of what's real, what's fictionalized. So, for instance, the movie starts with this kind of flamboyant scene where Joseph Kelvin Harrison Jr.'s character has a violin off with Mozart's, and I meant to look up to see if that was real or not, but essentially, Mozart's. I can't believe it. It's such a disappointment. Yeah, because I loved Amadeus so much, that movie, and I don't remember that being in that film, although I guess it was later in time for Mozart. But it's like it starts off with this kind of like this very flamboyant scene of the two of them having this violin off, and the crowd's going crazy as they're like out violining each other, and it sort of sets an expectation that this is not going to be your like grandma's biopic. It's going to be more sort of like outrageous and sort of lavish, not to the level of like a Baz Luhrmann kind of thing, but it feels kind of more like that than sort of the more sort of staid biopic that you might expect. And the performances are good, and especially like I feel like the chemistry between Kelvin Harrison Jr. and Samara Weaving as this couple who are having this affair, that's really fun. I think that the movie starts to lose steam maybe about 2/3 of the way through, partly because it becomes more of a traditional biopic, and also because at that point it's more about like, the French Revolution and the beginnings of the French Revolution are in the background of this story. They go more into the foreground in the last third. And I just found that stuff not as interesting. And I found myself thinking that the film itself was trying to shoehorn in a more sort of dramatic, important thing that was happening beyond just the fact that, hey, here's this man because of the racism of the time, was not accepted, had to fight for everything that he got, and had lots of opportunities taken away from him simply because he was Black.
Mm-hmm.
That story is interesting enough on its own,
Right.
but when they start to add in the sort of French Revolution stuff and him kind of squaring off against Marie Antoinette, who was his like close friend, and they sort of had this like parting along the way, that stuff to me is just not as interesting and not as convincing. So I think if you're looking for a period piece that has a little bit of flair to it and some like interesting sexual romantic chemistry, I think the movie is good enough, but it definitely feels in some ways at the same time a bit of a missed opportunity.
Yeah, you need some historical context to understand why his place in this world matters. But yeah, all the French Revolution stuff is very traditional, and it's not nearly as interesting as this singular figure. Yeah, he and Samara Weaving have great chemistry. What I like about her character is that she's like a smartass. Like she's really insubordinate, like until she isn't. But like she thinks for herself, and she's a really cool chick, and she has like a way with a witty one-liner here or there. And the costume design is all spectacular, and like the production design. If you want like the fluffy, frothy confectionery design of the time, that is all there for you. And I'm glad the story exists in the world. You know, like Napoleon came through, from what the film tells us. Napoleon eventually comes through and just destroys his legacy. So the fact that 200 plus years later, there's now a film about this person that I'm guessing a lot of folks don't know about, I'm glad that it exists. And he is very good. And his evolution is interesting too. Like as he comes to embrace his cultural identity, you know, his mom arrives, and at first he's sort of embarrassed by her and reluctant to connect with her in any kind of emotional way. So watching that dynamic change, you know, it feels like it's good, but I wish there were more of that. Like that's an interesting dynamic there.
Yeah, one of the things that's very disappointing about the mother character who shows up in the film is that initially you think this is going to be a really important relationship, him in some ways reconnecting with this part of his life that he never knew. He never really kind of knew his mother. And unfortunately, like the mother character becomes one of those things where every third or fourth scene in the film, we go back to the mother, and the mother is essentially checking in on her son so that we can see like where he is in his like narrative arc at that point, where like the mom shows up and says, you know, now Joseph, how are you feeling about this? And he tells her how he's doing. And again, like that's the other element that feels like a bit like a missed opportunity. You know, I don't often want movies to be longer, but this almost feels like it could be an epic and there could be more stuff kind of going on. And you mentioned like the look of this movie. There's a lot of Amadeus in this movie. The movie Amadeus in this movie. Minnie Driver has sort of a small part in the movie, and she is sort of a diva-ish star at the time, and she sort of has fun with that role. To use the trade parlance, it is handsomely mounted, and tech credits are pro. That's how I would sort of describe. And it's true. That stuff is actually true about the movie. But put it this way, this movie premiered at the Toronto Film Festival last year. And I think it's somewhat telling that there has not been a lot of buzz out of Toronto and since. I think the general consensus is that the movie is, as I told a friend afterwards, aggressively fine. It's aggressively fine. It's like, it's solid. Yeah.
So what's your aggressively fine number then?
I am going with a 6.0, which is my fine scale. Yeah.
Okay. I will say 6.8. Tim, you're awesome. Will you come back and hang out once you're done with your fencing practice?
If I make it out alive, yes, I will happily come back. And the fencing, in case you're wondering, since you have me on, the fencing is impeccable in the film. There's actually some decent fencing scenes in this movie, though. They are kind of fun. But yes, I'd love to be back whenever you want me.
Cool. Thank you. Chevaliers in theaters.